Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Tiana Webb Evans, founder of Jamaica Art Society. I'll be moderating this conversation with wonderful leaders in the Caribbean, but also global art space. I think today one of the things that we want to approach is usability, right? So it's not a conversation for conversation's sake, but here we want to make sure that the conversation brings you into Caribbean-ness. We don't want to make assumptions that the audience knows what it means to be Caribbean, what it means to work here and abroad, what those perspectives entail. So we're going to make sure that we unpack that a little bit, as well as we want to leave you with actionable tips and tools for this work that we all need to do together to shape the future. And one of the things that really excites me about being a Caribbean person is I feel fully that there are things about our experiences and perspectives that could be useful for everyone. And so living beyond the binaries is something that we as Caribbean people embody and inhabit. And I do think it is part of the way forward. And so with that in mind, I wanted to situate everyone's practices a little bit and have them talk about what they do, or part of what they do, because multiplicity is also part of our framework. So today we have Christopher Cozier, who engages in collective practice through Alice Yard's residencies and interventions. Daniela Fifi, who contributes scholarly inquiry through her research and writing on Caribbean museology. Danny Báez, who focuses on market development through MECA Art Fair and his gallery Regular Normal. If you have not been there, he has a booth in the fair, so make sure you visit and buy work. And Lavon Bell, an artist that activates public consciousness through monumental installations, including I Am Queen Mary, that was installed in Denmark and was a site of conscious awareness. So I don't know who wants to go first, but maybe Danny, since you're right across from me. You're in the hot seat. Do you want to talk a little bit about the genesis of MECA Art Fair
Sure.
and Regular Normal?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. First thing first, thank you everybody for being here. I have allergies, heavy case of allergies, so my voice is not going to be the best. That said, thank you to conductor and the whole team behind this, and my longtime friend Tiana for having me in this panel. So pretty much at this point right now, I'm a former co-founder of MECA Art Fair because MECA do not exist any longer. That said, we hope to transform what we did, that synergy, into something else moving forward, especially focusing on the Dominican Republic first because this is the place I come from. So MECA started in 2015 as an idea of what I needed to do to stay employed in the art world, in the sense of, like, at the time I didn't see myself as someone that would be here for longer than the time that I was, for many reasons that you guys know, but we're not going to explain here. And my idea of staying around was creating my own place of work, and that was what MECA came around. We started MECA with Tony Rodriguez, who is Puerto Rican. Back in 2017, the first time that happens as a physical fair in Puerto Rico. And why Puerto Rico? Because I'm Dominican, right? Why I didn't decide to go straight to my island and do it there. There was many factors that play into the reasoning of that. And it's because when I started working in the art business with a artist called Rick Vanish, and then eventually I transferred to his art dealer at the time, Gavin Brown, I got to connect with Puerto Rican collectors. So I never had the chance to do so in my native island. And the fact that Puerto Rico, unfortunately, is still a colony of the United States and the oldest colony in the world right now, they have dollars. So there was this idea also that I don't have to transfer or translate the currency of what I'm selling because it's the same price over there. And it's kind of like a surface reasoning, but it was the one that made sense to me at the time, knowing the collectors, the currency situation, and the fact that if you're based in the United States, not that you need a visa to go to the Dominican Republic, pretty much everybody's welcome, but you don't have to do the paperwork to transfer anything, because if you're anywhere in the USA mainland, the way they call it, you can travel there with your driver's license or ID. You don't need a passport or any paperwork. So that was the reasoning behind all this situation in Puerto Rico. We did 3 editions, 2017, 2018, 2019. Then Hurricane Maria happened, and we stopped. And then eventually I was able to bring it to my country in 2023, 2024. What was achieved, I believe, mostly in the Dominican Republic was the first ever art fair that happened in the country, which is something that I'm very humbled by. And the only one up to this point. And created this kind of sentiment that the local circuits felt like seen. I couldn't have everybody, but the people that were able to partake or come around understood that this is something that could create a longer impact in the region, especially for the Dominican Republic, because we are not allowed to leave the country without a visa to many places. So bringing these people from other places, curators, collectors, scholars, in there, and they have the chance to see them without having to leave the country, was something that I'm very, not proud of, but like joyful about it.
And then if you could quickly just talk about that relationship in Regular Normal, the gallery that we see here today, and how that project connects to your work in Dominican Republic.
Yeah, well, Regular Normal started in 2020 during the pandemic, in November 2020 to be more specific. And it came up actually from Instagram posts that I was making at the time, where artists were asking to be visited at their studios, but because of the pandemic, many people didn't feel comfortable going to spaces. So I asked them, are you okay if I go in person? And many of them say yes. And I started putting this caption that it was called the privilege of getting together, which is like something that we took for granted. That you can go see, I'm gonna see my friends in Coon, and then suddenly you cannot see anybody. And then you're like, oh shit, I wanna see people, sorry. You wanna see people now in person. And I started going to the studio, so I was like, who is really coming to see them? Because they want to be seen, not beyond the screens, in person. And I say to myself, I'm never going to open a gallery. This is one of the most difficult things that you can do in life. But then I spit onto the sky and fell on my face. And October 2020, I registered myself as a business in New York State and said, you know what, I'm going to do a gallery to bring all these people that I've been seeing during this time and do the show. So it wasn't particularly like based on Caribbean artists, was artists of color, first and foremost. So the first show that I did was called The Privilege of Getting Together, which is the name of the series of Instagram. And I started with 16 artists in Chinatown. That was my space. And then eventually I started working with a lot of Dominican artists, of course, because I live in New York City, one of them being Bonnie Ramirez, the most important Dominican artist right now, right here in the audience, with such a privilege. And my program started becoming more not only Caribbean driven, but like mostly Dominican, but it's not limited to it. So the connection directly to MECA, it's like I was showing my own fair without paying the booth. So that was the direct connection. And from that, I think Regular Normal is gonna become the next stage of what I'm gonna do in the Caribbean.
Right.
The MECA is not anymore.
And thank you for that, because having a gallery is very brave. Especially the way that the industry has changed to kind of a corporate mega gallery matrix. And anyone who's showing today is taking great risk to put this work forward. Thinking about risk and putting work forward, I wanted to pivot to Christopher and Alice Yard. And if you could tell the audience a little bit about Alice Yard and how that space has become a legendary space in the Caribbean and the genesis of that.
Okay, thanks, of course, for Powerhouse and everyone who brought us all here. Thanks for the question. To describe Alice Yard and what we didn't launch it as an organization and search for a clientele, right? It happened very much by accident. A group of artists wanted to do something in 2006. They asked me to be involved. And one young artist wanted to do a video installation, and they wanted a moldy, abandoned, backyard kind of space. And a friend of mine who was an architect, Sean Leonard, said, oh, well, there's a kind of yard that I used to play in as a child in my great-grandmother's house. I'll clean it out for that artist. And what happened is the event took place, the artist did the installation, and then about 2 weeks later, the phone starts ringing. Another artist, can I use the space? Can I use the space? Sean called me back. Chris, I don't know anything about this. I'm an architect. I can create space for people to do things, but I don't know how to. And one thing led to another. And so in the first iteration of the space, it sort of became a default setting for the failures in the society in terms of institutions and things like that, because, you know, space is often weaponized in our cultural history. You know, the minute you say, I want space, everybody goes like this. You know, we have a history of that. And then, of course, we live in a society that's very shrewd, you know, because of our colonial history. So when a young artist says, I want to do this, two things happen, you know? And the other thing is, that's nonsense. What are you doing that for, right? So the first phase of Alice Yard is that Sean is an architect, he owns the space. I was an artist with a kind of critical interest. Nicholas Laughlin was a writer, editor, said, let's put our heads together. We musicians were looking for places to rehearse. So we said, okay, let's renovate a part of it and make a soundproof room. And, but it wasn't like we were raising money. Like different people came to us and rolled up their sleeves. Like a Japanese sound engineer was in Trinidad. He was interested in this steel band, how to record it, which has been a long question going back like 50 years. The technology of recording steel band live is a real problem. And he said, well, okay, I'll figure out how to make this room sonic for bands to rehearse and for them to do recordings. And then, of course, as you saw in the photography, different people started coming. There was a group called 1,000 Mocos, where walking on stilts was becoming fashionable amongst a lot of young people. And when it first took off in Trinidad with a new generation, people were coming to them and saying, well, you know, you got to go and listen to the elders and, you know, and hear the mythology. And Kristen Chen, who is a designer but very interested in that because he studied, he was a gymnast, he studied, you know, was fascinated by the act of, and he came to me and said, what do I do? And all these people complain. I said, listen, forget about all the mythology. We want young people involved. See it like Frisbee or hula hoop or footsie when you were children, right? The mythology will come later. It's just a skill. And kids were coming and the group, so, you know, the people, more and more people started becoming involved. And more activities were taking place at the yard. And of course, the big question is, how do we fund it? And we never applied for funds. It was about sharing and collaborating. And then, I won't go through the whole thing because we have lots to discuss, but basically Alice Yard started first with a site. We were first in Woodbrook, a part of the city famous for yards where people work at Carnival. Sean owned another building in Belmont, which is one of the oldest communities on the eastern side of Port of Spain. And he didn't know what to do with the building. He bought it as an investment, and it was sitting there empty. And he said, well, maybe we should move there. And it happened just before COVID. And so the kind of lay of the land for Alice Yard now is we're in this community, which is called Belmont, which is known for cultural production. It used to be Freetown. It became Belmont in the 19th century. It's famous for carnival, it's famous for literary societies. For lack of a better terminology, Belmont is to Port of Spain something like what Harlem is to New York. A lot of very famous people, have their roots in Belmont. Darcus Howe in London, Stokely Carmichael in the US. It was a place for debating societies, piano clubs, lots of black people in suits with their hair brushed down back in the 1920s and so on. It's one of those kinds of places, right? And debating societies and all kind of thing, right? And so it's a kind of place that is very interested in cultural activities. And where we are now, we've moved to this new space. We are working with artists, but Aliciad also became a vehicle for artists in the diaspora and artists from other Caribbean islands to kind of enter other Caribbean spaces, because it's really hard. Everybody opens a residency and tells you have to apply, you have to raise money. No, we just said, if you can find your way there, we'll put you up. Sometimes if we get a little bit of money, people have donated money to us to do things. We'll support you. And then also, it kind of coincided with the evolution of the internet and social media. So the discussion became a series of sort of wider circles in the diaspora, in the region. And then something which we are dealing with, I hope we'll get to discuss, because it's going to affect all of us, is we realize when we participated in Documenta with Rand Grouper and so on, and that whole concept of Lumbang and all those kinds of things, we realized, is Aliciad a place, a site, or is it a conversation? And
nice.
That was a real big turning point for us to come to terms with that. And is the process an artwork and a conversation
in itself, yeah.
as opposed to an edifice, a site, a building, and that's kind of where we are now, because it seems to continue, and satellite spaces are opening throughout the region that are in dialogue with us, like say Ruby Crewell in London, and other, and so I'll stop there, but it's really a laboratory, a kind of rehearsal space for artists where they find community and dialogue to position themselves accordingly.
It's interesting to hear about a few aspects I just want to touch on. The serendipity, the mobility in terms of community, and also the idea of visual arts and sort of this kind of critical and rigorous space that is inclusive of music, of performance, of painting, of thinking, and sort of that dynamism, I think, is really interesting. It might seem like I was going to go to Levon, but I'm not going to go to Levon yet because there's an exclamation point on the end of this. And Daniela, what I wanted to segue into is when we're talking about space and sort of the informality of Aliciad. And so in your work, looking at critical issues within the museum and the institution across the Caribbean, can you, number one, share how your scholarship ended up in that direction? And then two, just speak a little bit, we're gonna get into it a little bit more later on, but a little bit about what you're seeing and what you started to see that kind of evoked this deeper dive into museology in the Caribbean.
Okay, thank you for the question, and also thank you, Power Arts, I'd like to start the same, for the opportunity of being here. So Critical Issues in Caribbean Museums was released this year. It's a publication that I edited, that the impetus of it was a conversation, similar to Aliciad, of, initially it started as a brainstorm between 10 Caribbean museum professionals, and we define the Caribbean not necessarily as a space, a geographical space around the Caribbean Sea, but also as a broader conversation, as a cultural space. And if you think of the Caribbean that way, when you're thinking about Caribbean museology, it doesn't only encompass the Caribbean, the insular Caribbean, but also collections that exist outside of the region. Here in the United States, for example, the United Kingdom, where we have many historical relationships. So in speaking with museologists here in the US and in the Caribbean, the impetus of it was thinking about networks that we could form to confront some of the challenges and successes that we were facing. The underlying sort of rubric that we came up with was thinking about decolonization and how we were activating decolonization within each of our own practices, whether it be in museum education, where my background is from, the interpretive arm of museums, or within conservation, or within sort of management, policy making, legislation, or within curatorial practice. And what we found was that different museums in the region were, on the impetus of independence in an effort to self-actualize our own cultural identities, were using decolonized methodologies, for example, within museum education, of thinking of our own selves of who we are, separate from a historical presence. And spaces like Alice Yard is doing that alongside, parallel to the museum. And then within conservation efforts, we have a conservator who contributed a chapter to the book, thinking of indigenous knowledge being implemented into conservation practices as well. So knowledge making, not only existing in a conventional sense of how we produce narratives in curatorial work, but also in other aspects of museology in conservation. How do you use something outside of what the Western scientific realm and incorporate indigenous knowledge into how you conserve and care and think about an object? So this is much of what the book is talking about. We think we have centered it around two aspects of decolonization, because that can be a rabbit hole. When we were having a conversation prior to this talk, Chris rightfully brought up, but when we speak about decoloniality, what are we speaking about? It's so broad, like what does that mean? And that's what we had to tackle with when we were thinking of it in terms of the book. What exactly do we mean when we're addressing it? There are two theorists, Bergeron and Rivette, who are part of the International Council of Museums, who posit that decoloniality means thinking about the mind of the museum, the heart of it, the underlying issues of it. And if you can address that, sort of the body of the museum and the people who make it up, then all of the departments holistically are affected by those changes. So it's not just a conventional sense of scholarship and research, but also in care, the programming of it, which is my area of expertise, and also curatorial work.
And so it's interesting because I'm sensitive to, audience, and sometimes when you're in this context, in an American context, the word coloniality feels very distant and foreign. And so it's very important to understand that in the Caribbean, the word, the language, the very recent independences do make the idea of coloniality prescient and real. But we're going to deconstruct that in a little bit, and this is the good time to pivot to Lavon's work as an artist. And I think one of the things I would love for you to talk about is also the monumentality of your work and how those interventions, you from island to global interventionist is really interesting. So if you could talk a little bit about one of your most famous works and sort of how your practice evolved to that scale.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I just want to say I have a long history with Powerhouse. I was their very first artist client way in 2019. And then most recently, we worked on another project together, the House That Freedom's Built. The question about monumentality for me is interesting because I never set out to make monuments. When I went to art school in Cuba and I had a class about monuments, I was taught they were kind of instruments of power, and not in a good way. You know, what was interesting, for example, at the time that I studied in Cuba, Fidel Castro was still the president, and he had forbid that any monuments would be made about him, not only in his life, but even in his death. And I thought, wow, what an extreme form of power, because, you know, he became another kind of monument by making himself into a myth. And so I've always been thinking a lot about the different kinds of monumentality. And the first project that I was really invited to consider this was, many people may not realize the Virgin Islands is a current colony of the United States, but we've been colonized like many places in the Caribbean multiple times. But the longest and the most impactful in terms of our infrastructure is Denmark. And so we were a colony of Denmark for about 250 years. And many of you guys might have been like, Denmark? They did that? They were a part of the colonizers? Yes,
right,
they were.
They tend to slip under the radar.
Because they have been able to mythologize themselves away from being that to being like the happiest country on earth and things like that. So as 2017, the 100-year anniversary of the sale and transfer of what was the Danish West Indies, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, to the US was happening. Jeanette Ehlers and myself, who's an Afro-Danish artist, had been invited to consider, would you guys want to do a monument? Both of our works had actually already been thinking a lot about the colonial relationship. And we had been invited to do that. We decided, we had two separate projects, and we decided, for various reasons, to actually work together. And that project, I mean, transformed, I think, both of our lives and our practices. I will say that it was the first project that I've done where you get to really see how public art can change the consciousness of a space. And it's also important to note that it was an artist-driven project. So in the ways that I had first learned about what monuments, or how monuments come to be, I had learned that they were first state-driven projects, instruments of power. But when artists step into that space and they drive those projects, it's power, but in another space. It's like us being able to take control over narratives and spaces and transform them. And you know, that project, you know, of course, has changed the trajectory of my practice. I've now been invited to consider monumentality in many different ways, many different kinds of projects like the ones here, which is called the House That Freedom's Built, which is about, you know, it's thinking through different spaces, or basically how people navigate freedom through domestic space. You know, but I think my current practice as an artist, I'm multidisciplinary, is thinking through monumentality in many different ways, how like the hurricane is a kind of monument, how salsa moves is a kind of monument of the body, how monumentality can exist in many different ways. And I think, you know, as Caribbean people, I think that kind of, the ways that we can reimagine concepts and how we interact with them from our very deep sense of place and our sense of the ways that we interact with our history and our environment, I think that's something that I look forward to talking with the rest of the group about.
Well, it's a great segue into, you know, the idea of sovereign relations. And so we were talking about not only sovereignty in terms of the island state, but personal sovereignty as well. And so, you know, Christopher, you said something that stuck with me, and this is true, and we won't go on a tangent about this, but he said that in the Caribbean, we have a critical disposition, and that is absolutely the case. And so in that case, how can a Caribbean lens expand an American and European understanding of globality and coloniality? And so one of the things we were talking about is this idea of the geographic positioning of the Caribbean and what it means to be in proximity, let's say, to the United States, in terms of the idea of coloniality. And one of the interventions on even my thinking was, no, you guys don't talk about it that way here, but you are actually still in a colonial framework. And so, Chris, I'm gonna go to you. Do you want to expound on that a little bit for the audience?
Oh boy. Well, yeah, I think what constitutes the Caribbean, I think, is, as I said, a critical disposition. It's a way of seeing the world, of understanding the world based on a very particular kind of experience, which is the beginning of this whole project in the Americas, which is most Caribbean islands were external labor camps of Europe. They were not supposed to be social, civic environments. And the burden of responsibility to make them into social spaces fell on the ex-slaves and indentured people and the people that found themselves there that had been transplanted from different parts of the world. That's a very American story. In fact, you look at a small island like St. Kitts or Barbados was already intact as a functioning colony before the United States. So there's a kind of way that what's happening in the US now, right now, in terms of you taking 100 years just for black people to have the right to vote safely, are things that are rooted in kind of colonial desires, aspirations, and menace, which is something we know very well. So I think, and when you talk about the Caribbean people have been involved in these struggles in London, in North Africa, because you're talking about, if you just look at Pan-Africanism as a movement, the first conference in 1900 to talk about the predicament of black people on the planet, which was called by Henry Sylvester Williams, which then inspired people like Marcus Garvey. And he was a man from Trinidad who went out there asking these questions. So in that sense, I feel it's not so much, it's like we've always been there, but sometimes it just takes you just have to turn the, it's like when you're looking for a lens, you have to turn the lens to realize, because so many people that are part of the experiments and the arguments that are going on in these societies, whether, as I said earlier, Stokely Carmichael, Darcus Howe, C.L.R. James, Fanon, Padmore in Africa. And I think it comes from the fact that we are the beginning of this enterprise, transnational labor relations. And of course now we are becoming nation states, but that's the shortest part of our history. The longer part of our history is the history of resistance and struggle under these auspices. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in terms of that resistance and struggle for the rest of the panel, how does that inform your practices in terms of what I see, a resiliency and awareness that is brought into these frameworks? And so when I say brought into these frameworks, one thing about sort of American culture is there's a deep intentionality around the programming of experience. And so, without going into the history of that, there is a lot of effort put into how people think, what is normal, what is this, Disney World is a serious enterprise, and so we don't have a Disney in the Caribbean. And so with that in mind, there's a broader awareness of your positionality, your beingness, but also your connection as a nation, as a personhood in this space. Does that make sense? So I'm curious about your experiences coming here to do your work and sort of bringing the audience into how you've intervened on these systems here, you know, in terms of what's the difference? You know, what can you do in the US that you wouldn't do in the Caribbean, and kind of vice versa? Like, what does that look like in terms of your individual practices?
I would love to start by answering that. When I graduated from art school in 2005, I'm aging myself, but that's okay. My mentor told me, do not stay in the Caribbean. She was like, don't stay, go to Europe, go to the US, do not stay. This gentleman over here to my left, that we met, I said this to him in our preparation, but you know, I met Chris in my 20-something years ago. I was born in Tobago. My mother's side of the family's from Trinidad and Tobago, so I used to go more regularly. And when I met him, he said something that it's really changed me as an artist. And he said, you know, so many artists from the Caribbean, we look to Europe and the US like they're the sun, and we angle towards them. And he was like, we need to be our own sun. And I really feel that that's what he's done when he's, you know, stayed in the Caribbean, created Alice Yard, and that was very inspiring for me. And so to prove my mentor wrong, I stayed at home and decided to find a way to be an artist in the world and not just in the Caribbean. And, you know, as Chris also mentioned, I think that also happened because of the rise of the internet. And so that allowed us to have a particular kind of visibility. And then, of course, you know, we always have to name our privileges. Although we are a colony of the United States, that also means I have a golden passport. So I am able to travel in ways that my neighbors in La República Dominicana or in Haiti or in other places are not able to. So mobility is still really important. I mean, even our ability to be here and talk with you, there's a privilege in that. But I do think that my practice has always been very, very rooted in, like, we are the center. We are the center. And so, you know, and what does that mean to, you know, to operate from that place? You know, I mean, just even, and Danny also deciding, like, I'm gonna do an art fair in the Caribbean. You know, I think that all of those gestures are incredibly bold, and they also reflect this attitude and positionality of recognizing that we are our own sons.
Something you said that I just want to say that about where we are now. Mm-hmm. When I came out of art school in 1988 and was pounding pavements in Soho and the Lower East Side, I had a studio in Greenpoint. I remember asking a gallery director to come into my studio in Brooklyn. And they said to me, I don't know what vaccinations or inoculations, I need to go to Brooklyn. So, I mean, you know, it's really interesting that we're having this conversation here now, because the art world of the late 80s was 2 or 3 blocks downtown New York. You know, so think about that, what's happening now. We're in Brooklyn, right? Yeah.
So I don't know if Danielle or Danny want to respond to that as well, because one of the things that I'm always thinking about is language, right? And so making sure that we are also speaking to the privilege of being in the Caribbean, because the privilege is not always here. And so if we also want to talk about why stay in the Caribbean, I mean, there are obvious reasons, but I do think those reasons need to be surfaced in terms of practice, in terms of thinking, in terms of writing. So I don't know if Danny or Daniela want to speak about that.
I think that the first, when you opened the conversation, you were speaking about, you know, how are we positioning the Caribbean? And I think the question you're asking is surfacing within me ideas of what are we speaking about when we're speaking about the region. Which is what I referenced earlier when, you know, it was about 10 or 15 museum professionals sat and thought about, this is a book about Caribbean museology. how are we positioning the Caribbean and where are we speaking from? And we all sort of agreed that our ideas around what the Caribbean is a global space. Chris sort of referenced the ideas of the Americas being sparked within the region itself because there were these, encounters, colonial encounters that were happening. I guess in my own practice, I see the Caribbean in that way. It's an exchange between the region itself as in surrounding the Caribbean Sea, but the global Caribbean in the sense of it being a cultural space that exists in the Smithsonian. It exists right now at the American Folk Art Museum. We've had the John Dunkley exhibition, which is Jamaican artists. I think that the region is something that moves back and forth. It has, referencing, I guess, glissant, it has this sort of fluidity to it. So I don't separate my practices and this, I can do this in the region and I do this outside the region. I feel as though the way that I approach work exists in all spaces. And the Caribbean, also the Caribbean exists in all those spaces as well, both here in the United States as well as within the Caribbean.
And so how do we continue to kind of surface this dialogue? Because first and foremost, thank you, conductor, for allowing us to have this conversation. But I understand that, especially given our history and the mobilities. But in terms of being seen, I don't necessarily know if others can see. We can see each other, but I don't know if others can see us. And so one of the things that might seem trite, but is something that I'm recognizing in this particular moment with this particular audience is I don't want to make the assumption that people understand the Caribbean, there are Caribbean people here, beyond the postcard. And so I always find that I am in battle with the postcard, in terms of the idea of the Caribbean as paradise, the idea of the Caribbean as a site of tourism. And so for me personally in my work, brand Jamaica is a very strong brand. And when people think Jamaica, they think reggae music, they think beach, they think, whatever the myriad of things, Rastafari, Bob Marley, et cetera. They don't think Sylvia Wynter. They don't think about David Boxer. They're not thinking about Barrington Watson or John Dunkley, right? They're not thinking about our philosophical and intellectual contributions necessarily. We might know it in terms of our work and awareness, but I think part of the work today that we're all doing, or the transformation of the work, has to do with unearthing and making visible the contributions, not just for accolades, but so it can help undo some of the things that we're collectively facing now. So I would love for you to expound on that a little bit.
The reasoning for the book is embedded within your response, meaning that I believe that is grounded in research publications, I guess because I'm coming from that type of background, that when something is on paper, that archival, or even art making, when something is in the world in that way, it makes visible. And we have to, as practitioners, ensure, I see it as our obligation to write our histories from our voices, from our perspectives, to make art within, within communities, or influenced by our knowledge making within our communities as well. So we make visible through our practice. I believe that, the institutions will be drawn to that in their times and movements of waves of influence that happen, but we need to keep creating.
Thinking about creating an audiences and visibility, Danny, I want to pivot to you. In terms of audience development, right? And so we talk about this idea of community care ecosystem and audience development. You are one of the founders of ARTNOIR, and if you guys don't know what ARTNOIR is, you should find out. Because you should. They are super active as ARTNOIR family.
Hello. Yeah, okay.
So thinking about ecosystem development, ARTNOIR has been developing ecosystems around Black art globally for how many years? Is it a decade yet?
13 years now.
13 years.
Yes, I mean, started slowly, but then now.
13 years.
Yeah, where we are now.
You think about MECA Art Fair, you think about the gallery, and I'm curious about your approach to audience development, and then we'll segue from that because we can talk to everyone else about that as well.
Well, I believe the audience was already there. It's your own circuit of creative and artists in that. And then once you bring that to them and make it accessible for them to be part of this, they're gonna bring the people that comes with them. So that is the most linear way to create audience because, okay, I'm gonna bring this to these 10 people and I'm pretty sure they're gonna bring one person each, just 20 and so and so and so. It's just, they just, I don't think they were waiting, but they were like looking forward to something like this to happen maybe at some point or thought about it and didn't take place before because they were already like, the audience for it existed. I just dropped something there and they all came to it. It's a kind of different audience because ARTNOIR is New York based, New York created, and New York City is the greatest capital of art in the planet. I believe so. If you want to say otherwise, it's okay. Keep in mind that New York City alone, not United States, New York City accounts for 48% of the art market global. So doesn't mean that educational, I don't know, any other kind of art stream, it's the main one here, but the commerce one is the main one. So, and that brings everything else together. So I don't know, I just went and did something based on what I learned and what I knew about my own country, because I left 23 years ago, and I never did anything there, like as what I'm doing now. And this was not the path that I was thinking. I was thinking about to be a baseball player. Imagine how cliche of me. And I didn't do it. I didn't have the discipline for it. So eventually I've fallen into this and understood that at that time I thought the Caribbean needed an art fair. They don't need an art fair, you get me? But like I wanted to do it there for many various reasons. But I want to track back into what you're saying about like I want to understand what is sovereign in the Caribbean. Because the extraction of goods is still happening today. It's not violent as it was before, but it's happening through business and commerce and governments allowing this to happen. And that is one of the main reasons why we live in the country. And kudos to you, Levon, for sticking around, so you're better than us. And you still in Trinidad, so that too. But I came here because my mom brought me here. And I didn't know what I'm gonna do, so the idea of the Caribbean is we fun. You don't have to think. And that you were saying there was many scholars and intellectuals living in it, but that's never exported. You have to be from the place to understand that. And even when you're from island to island, you don't know that because there's this political divide, especially in my country, as you guys know, with a neighboring island and we're not, and who's better than that. So I think the audiences are already there. They're just waiting for someone to really like open the space for them to come together. It's not that hard actually. And based on like what is the meaning of like going somewhere else and bring it back. I don't want to say it's a necessary evil because we need to get rid of the evil already. But it's a necessary like kind of like joint effort between us here and the people that's already doing there and bring that back. I don't know if we need the colonizers, for lack of better words, to do what we do, but the system that we have in place has made that a mandate to a certain extent. So to kind of like raise something from the ground up there, even here it's difficult. Over there it's like 20 times worse, as you know. And people don't want to get into these spaces because the way, at least in the Dominican Republic, what is known is like you can go dance and drink and go to the beach. You don't need to think, you don't need to do any of this stuff. Like this is to chill, but there's more than that in every place in the Caribbean. So I don't know, the effort of bringing resources from another place there, it's tricky because you're still relying on people that really don't care what's happening down there.
So, thank you for saying the word care. I was alerted that we only have 5 minutes. This went so quickly. With that in mind, I want to make sure that we're wrapping with ideas and tools, speaking of care. And so if you guys don't mind just sharing 1 or 2 sentences about how care shows up in your practice and your philosophies around work. And then do we have time for questions? Okay, all right, so if you can share some notes on care, I would appreciate it. I'm sure the audience would appreciate it, and then we can have questions.
I think in my practice, care is bringing, I work with an interpretation arm of museums and museum education, and care is bringing our knowledge making to the fore. When we have artists on display that have sort of multiplicitous ideas of their own histories and identity, of making sure that those narratives are cared for.
I would think that care shows up in various ways in my practice, but I would say that collaboration is probably the biggest way at this point. Even though, you know, for example, like a monument like I Am Queen Mary, I think a lot of people think we did that in 2018 and it's over. I was just meeting with Jeanette today. You know, we're still writing grants to finalize the permanency. We're still, to hold a project like that for 10 years almost now has been a tremendous act of collaborative care. Yeah.
Chris?
Well, the word play comes up a lot in Alice Yard, and I don't know if you were noticing when the graphics were going, but a designer came up with an Alice Yard type for us. And when recently he was playing around with it, and when he turned the type upside down, the word play became held. And that was just the weirdest kind of serendipity, you know, because I think, yes, you know, people just want to do stuff and do it together. Because I think what constitutes the Caribbean isn't so much a geography or a, you know, it's if 4 people get together in a room anywhere in the world on the street and they start talking and laughing or gesturing, to me that's where the Caribbean is at that particular moment in time. And I think that's what we've learned through the process of Alice Yard.
That's gorgeous. Danny?
In my practice, I think care is me being intentional and honest. If I don't feel it, I'm not gonna blow your brain on it. Like, my God would tell me that it's not for me, and whenever the time comes, and right, if it's for me, it's for me. If not, I'm gonna show you the way to somebody else that can actually help. So being intentional as well.
I love that. We can have a whole talk about that interaction, and so if we could turn things over to the audience. Does anyone have, how much time do we have? Do you have time for a couple questions? Okay. Anyone? Don't be shy.
I'm glad. Oh, great. I was going to say, I'm like, I have a question.
Thank you all for this amazing presentation. Each one of you are such a big inspiration for the work of many artists and curators. And it was amazing to have you all like together and weaving in. And I have a question around like things that are gonna be happening or that are happening right now in the Caribbean that are inspiring you all.
Nice question.
I'll take this one real quick. And by the way, Dulcina is a great collaborator of MECA, great curator and writer. So please, if you need something, reach out to her. She's amazing. So pretty much, I'm gonna take this one because there's someone that's doing something within the culinary arts in the Dominican Republic. It's someone that it's a friend of ours, Olivier Burr, who is born in Switzerland to black Dominican mom, a white Swiss man, of course. And he was born and raised in Zurich. And when I started doing MECA, he was idolizing things that he wanted to do in the country, and then he moved there. Now he lives there for almost 3 years now, and he has started this network of local eateries and food makers that some society, high society, don't go to, have access, but through him is channeling into these people understanding their own cuisine. You get me? There's people that was born and raised in the Dominican Republic that don't know what a Johnny Cake is. It's a Johnny Cake steak on the Korean, on our own terms. And they've never had it before because it's not for them. They didn't grow up like this. They're like privileged. But now, because he has established himself as a voice of sorts, and he's for the peoples, he has brought that into space. So I'm very excited. It's called Cómalo, which means coma más local, eat more local. And right now it's the thing that has me the most pumped about it. So he's creating this ecosystem of understanding your own labor of what it goes into the kitchen with what we call humble families. You get me? Elevating to the next stage without losing the cultural touch or the sensibility that means for everybody. So that's what I'm excited about.
We need to talk about that at some point because it's the same thing in Jamaica as well. And so the idea of having an intervention where someone can go back to indigenous food and technology and health, but that's another conversation. Anyway, what are you guys excited about?
I would say I am, the House of Freedom to Build project that I bought this house in 2011 with the intention of stabilizing my artist practice by having a studio space, and then shortly after learned about that it had this amazing history, how it was a part of, a free colored and black community in the 1800s, actually 1700s, as far back as the 1700s. And that was my art studio for about 12 years until I moved into a bigger space. But I always wanted to make that space more available for the public. So I'm in the process now of transforming that space into kind of a residency space. So I'm excited about that, yeah.
Nice. Everyone follow Levon so you can go.
Congratulations.
Yeah, love that.
I always get excited when a young artist calls me and said, I'm working on something, what do you think? It means that the world is turning. But I think when I'm home, what excites me a lot is just living in the Caribbean. It's like an ongoing event. This sounds really tangential, but when you were talking about food, there's a war, sadly, in Syria over the last couple of years, which caused a lot of people to be displaced there now. So when you think of street food in Trinidad, you think of doubles and roti and thing. But actually, there's more shawarma being sold on the streets of Port of Spain because of Assad, right? And then what's weird now is, it comes with tahini sauce and all that kind of thing, kind of sour, So now you can get shawarma with pineapple and pepper sauce. Believe it. So yeah. So
flights will be booked immediately.
Yeah. The Caribbean is an ongoing event. So there's also you talk about preserving what's indigenous, but you also have to keep up with what's coming, and it's not linked to local events. There's a war in So I know Assad was a pain in the ass, but because of Assad, I can now eat shawarma with pineapple and pepper sauce.
And I love that because you think about glissant and being rooted yet rhizomatic. We are not static, no one's static, but we particularly are the dub. It's a place of convenings of ideas. Daniela?
A project I'm excited about now, I can't speak too much about it because it's in the process, is working with the National Trust in Trinidad. It's a curatorial educational venture, and we're looking at much of what I spoke about before, unearthing histories, bringing narratives that have been hidden in different ways just to the fore through artistic practice, but also educational ventures. And I'm really excited about it in looking at sort of the resilience of our people in many different ways, and how it's tied into histories of the region, but also tied into what we spoke about in globality of the region.
Indeed. I'll just drop in with what's going on in Jamaica. I see Simon Benjamin in the audience, my partner in crime over there. But what's really interesting in Jamaica, we have a propensity for what one would call prideful arrogance. And so there's been a bit of disruption at home. And so what happens if you do one thing there, everyone else says, I can do it better. And so there is so much action around being present, who gets to be the most present, and it's really reignited the art ecosystem in and around Kingston. We're deeply competitive, that's why we're, award-winning athletes. And so we are coming to our next biennial in December. So if anybody's interested in experiencing Kingston at its fullest art moment, right after Art Basel that weekend, the National Gallery will be opening the forthcoming biennial. So we're excited about that. Do we have time for one more? Or are we?
Hi, this was an amazing talk, so thank you all for being here. I have a question related to monuments. You talked about you not really seeing yourself going in the direction of monuments at first. I was wondering how you kind of negotiate sort of monuments as being legible to I don't know, people that are seeing it versus how you make it versus how maybe the state might see it, and sort of how do you negotiate monuments as they age and how people see them and interpret them?
Can you repeat the last part of your question?
How do you negotiate people seeing them sort of in the space that they are versus how you see them and how, I don't know, yeah.
I will say that, in the process of making, a lot, for example, with I Am Queen Mary, we intentionally did not have a plaque that explains a lot. Because I think that, seeing a 2.5-story Black woman in a European city already says a lot. We didn't have to justify why she was there by telling you about the history of who she was, or the fact that you have to look up like that to see her already says a lot in your body. And it says a lot about other people's knowledge systems. So I think that when I hear you say negotiate, part of it is in the construction of, each decision that you're making and how you want the audience to react to the physical. But then there's a whole narrative building part that we've done a lot of work on, specifically with that one, because we were trying to raise money and make it permanent. And so, I've said this in different points, but we hired a PR firm to help us, which is not something that a lot of individual artists would do. But we actually, did I tell you this? One of my Jamaican friends who ran A&R for Atlantic Records, and sometimes you can learn from different disciplines. And in the music world, you hire publicists. You're not going to come out with an album and not hire a professional to help you. In the art world, that's not necessarily something that artists would do. But he kept teasing me and telling me, I guess you don't want nobody to know about your project. Why you don't get a publicist? So we ended up getting one. And that transformed how I saw the power of narrative and what happens when your work is in the New York Times on the cover of the culture section. How it shifts how people see your project, and it shifted the way the government reacted to our project, and that also allowed us to be able to get the permanent permission. And that narrative building, there's something that you can do intentionally, but then there's also what happens often in public art is you don't have control. You saw that you lose control over the narrative. So there's a part where you can be super intentional, and then there's another part where you have no control over what other people are gonna say, and that's a part of the work too. There were people who were angry about our work. They were angry that we put our bodies in the work. They were angry about the way she's sitting, why she looked like she's a European queen. She's not a European queen, she's a Black rebel queen. People had lots of things to say about, but all of that is a part of the dialogue. And so the negotiation is part intentional, and then part that it's just a part. I'll say this, I have a good friend of mine who's a mentor, Kendall Henry. He runs, I think he's assistant commissioner of the Percent for Art program in New York. And when the project came out and we were getting some of the negative feedback, which is hard to receive as an artist, he said to me, LaVon, the work is doing its job. If everyone saw the work and just was like, yay, you did a good job, that's not the work. The part of public art is creating the dialogue. And so controversy is literally counterpoints of view. That is what you want. You want people to have various types of perspectives, and they wrestle and enter the work from different ways. So I think, yeah, I think, and that's what I think can be powerful about projects that deal with monumentality.
Nice. Do we have time for one more, or do we need to wrap?
In America in the 70s and 60s, for women to become artists and to be recognized was maybe similar, and I'm curious, your perspective, to the challenges that the Caribbean artists may see themselves facing. Is there a specific challenge to women in the cultures that you're representing?
I mean, it's interesting. I'm not an artist in a formal sense. I consider myself an artist in terms of my social practice. And my presence is an intervention of space and time, and a negotiation of power, because my body, a woman, a Black woman, and then we enter the Caribbean, a darker-skinned woman in that space challenges all perceptions of power and possibility. And so it is a continuous negotiation, and I have found, although not easy here, a bit more progressive. Thoughts?
What you're saying here, the U.S. is more progressive, or the Caribbean is more progressive?
The U.S. Oh. Well, no, not progressive and abroad. Look, did you see him? He grabbed his microphone like he picked up a gun. I was like, no. In terms of being, I'm only speaking to, I'm not talking to the Caribbean as a whole. I'm speaking about Jamaica. I'm speaking about my experience as a Black, dark-skinned woman in a particular space, and women, because that's what she asked about. And so in my experience, there is that layer of challenge. It's not impossible, and there are many women. Our Minister of Culture is a woman, But in terms of the navigation and negotiation of day-to-day interactions, your femaleness is present. And as an executive, as a Black woman who has been in an art space for 25 years here, not easy either, but the navigation of it is slightly less complex in my experience.
So imagine how it is down there.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It's a huge struggle here. Imagine what that looks like. And the other thing that we are not talking about on this panel, again, different per island, is class. And that's a thing that is very, very present in the spaces that I'm moving through.
Yeah. I mean, was your question just like how it's different, or what?
I mean, I think I could speak from Trinidad. One of our most important artistic moments was in the 30s. And there hasn't been a lot of research on that, but it was called the Beacon Group. I think it moved to England as the New Beacon Group in the 60s and 70s. But in the 30s, there was a group of, women artists, writers, and so on, and even queer, in that conversation. But they were disbanded by the colonial authorities by the end of the 30s. And what empowered that group was that there were some men and women that had returned from Trinidad after serving in the First World War. And they did not want to defer to colonial functionaries. In other words, I came from the trenches, I worked as a nurse, I worked as a soldier, and I come back home and some minor clerk wants to give me lip simply because he's white and English. And that group, some of the people that are internationally known that came from that group are people like Padmore, C.L.R. James, and so on. Even the movie 1917 by Sam Mendes years ago, the character is based on his uncle, and who was one of the founders of that group that wrote some of the earliest women artists in Trinidad came from that group, but they spread out. One came to Harlem, and then of course there were political activists like Claudia Jones and people like that. So there's a long history, you know, but it took shape in a different mapping, because some of them got involved in Marxism, in the rights, you know, and things like that. But in terms of the contemporary situation in the Caribbean, it is predominantly women artists that are the most dynamic and in the current situation, particularly since the 90s. If you really do the demographics in the Caribbean, it's a lot more women out there positioning themselves, you know, and writing as well.
And I don't want to interrupt, but I think the other thing to your question, the conditions don't stop us. I think there's another thing that is really important that you have to understand is sort of the secret sauce, is we're deeply audacious. We have a ridiculous level of audacity. So we're not afraid to be ourselves, even though it's hard. We can do hard things, and we can do hard things very well.
One of my first projects when I started working in museums in the Caribbean was working at the National Art Gallery and Museum in Trinidad and Tobago in archival capacity. And I had to really look through the national collection and systematically categorize. And I was looking at, you know, who were the women artists being represented. At that time, our chief curator was very interested in her researches around women artists in the region. And there was an underrepresentation, as there is here. There are parallels of women's presence in the collection. There have been, you know, leaps of that in the United States of bringing more women presence. There's a National Women's Museum. And now, right now in Trinidad, we have a renovation of our national institution, of the National Museum and Art Gallery. And one of the initiatives is a new acquisition policy to ensure to be more inclusive of women artists and women voices in collection making.
Okay. Well, I think they're telling us we have to leave. First and foremost, thank you all for being here and participating and sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline and Adriana and the conductor team and the Powerhouse team for having us and surfacing this conversation. Have a good afternoon.